it's good that it's on this side so that...
Yes.
Is there interpretation here, or it's one language? It's monolingual, or there's French also, yes, okay. Basically English.
There is this.
Very good, yeah. Okay. Maybe if you ask me a difficult question and respond in French, just to give you a hard time. You better start.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anne Bernstein and from South Africa, and I'm going to be moderating this session. What I thought we'd do is I'm going to establish the context for our discussion and the way I see the issues, and then provoke our panel and draw out the best from their experience and knowledge and their insight, and then allow some opportunity for short comments from the floor, then come back and hopefully have another round with the panel. We don't have an enormous amount of time, so I'm going to be quite tough as the chair. Now, we're talking about an absolutely vital topic in my country, South Africa, and across the continent, certainly in the whole of Africa. The issue of unemployment and how we have much more job-intensive economies is absolutely vital. Let me start with my country and the nature of the challenge. South Africa, a country of about 51 million people, has an enormous youth unemployment problem. Well over 60% of young people are unemployed, and for many of them the prospects of ever getting a job are very, very sort of little indeed. My organization did research a few years ago on the northern part of South Africa, and if you're a young woman aged 18 to 30, that group is 90% unemployed. It's an absolute tragedy, and the lives that are really ruined because of the lack of opportunities to work is extremely concerning. So this is a very big issue in my country, and it's a big issue across the continent. Now, I was going to give you some statistics, but I don't believe a lot of the statistics. I'm not sure if they're referring to sub-Saharan Africa, the whole of Africa. The statistics aren't all that interesting. The important thing to know is that this is a massive phenomenon, 40 to 50% in very many countries of young people. Again, you can debate how you define young people. Is it 18 to 24? Is it 18 to 30? There is a massive unemployment challenge, and it's growing. That's what you need to bear in mind. Now, one of the aspects of this challenge has to do with where is this phenomenon taking place? Is it mainly rural or urban? And is this part of rates for a period? But in fact, the poverty rate in your country is not being significantly affected. And that's what counts. Don't forget, countries that are politically unstable are often unstable as conditions are improving. And it's the lower middle class or the middle class who, if things start to falter for a while, they're the most politically volatile. So the fact that growth is taking place in a lot of countries is fantastic. It also has challenges that have to be managed. And what's important is to have much more inclusive societies, because that's the only way we're going to provide more and more people with hope for the future and with a stake in the societies of which they're a part. The most critical part of inclusivity is effective education, which is not our topic today, but obviously related, quality education rather than access, but also a job. The enormous benefits of a job are not anymore theoretical discussion. We have seen the empirical reality of what happens in Asia when young people get a job, which is often not a great job. It's hard work, low wages, not great conditions, but it's a stepping stone to modernity. And that's part of inclusivity that's very important. Now, I'm not very comfortable with the topic of our discussion. People who talk about job creation often make it sound as though we should have make-work jobs, or somehow business should magically just double the number of people they employ. I think we have to start changing the language we use. We're talking about more job-intensive economies and how we get the kind of growth that is job-intensive. That's a very different thing because we're talking about sustainable jobs, not make-work jobs. So that's a critical issue. And I think one of the big opportunities that faces the continent at this point in the world's history is that wages are going up in China. It's said that they went up some 22% last year, and they projected to go up a lot more in the next few years. Now that represents an enormous opportunity for other countries because many people, many manufacturers are saying they're starting to look for where to locate next. And the question becomes, what is required for African countries to create the conditions to become hubs of low-wage manufacturing? I'm not part of the rural romantic school. Yes, I'm sure in some African countries you can increase productive employment in rural areas. That's great. Let's do it. But the fact of the world is that urbanization and increased economic growth go hand in hand. And we, in a world of increasingly high-tech, commercialized agriculture, it's going to be harder and harder to have more and more jobs in rural areas. You have to look to urbanization and urban manufacturing. And that's going to be absolutely key. So, what I'd like to focus this session on today is not to describe the challenge of employment. There is a massive challenge. We all know it takes different forms. That's not what we're trying to do today. What we want to do today is to talk about what countries should do about this. I should also say that I'm one of those people who's a bit allergic to sentences that start with Africa should do this or that. I don't know what that means. Africa is not China. This is a continent with lots and lots of different countries. So I think we should focus on what particular countries should do, or countries like this should do the following kinds of things. Let's try and get a lot more specific. The key challenge is scale. It's not about corporate social investment projects that involve 100 people or 100 entrepreneurs. It's scale. Scale. So I want to challenge everybody to think about the big issues of scale in terms of the challenge for many African countries, and to focus on what can we do? What should governments be doing? What can other people, other sectors in the society do that can have an impact on scale in terms of youth unemployment? Okay, so it's hopefully going to be a strategic discussion. Let me turn first to one of the members of our very distinguished panel, and actually I think the panel as described in your program is slightly different from the one that we have. So maybe I'm going to turn to members of the panel and ask them to respond to my challenge in no longer than 3 minutes for their opening comments, and perhaps if they could just introduce themselves very briefly so everybody has some understanding of who's part of this great panel. Let me turn to Lars Thunell first and ask him to respond. What should we be doing? What should countries do about the massive challenge of youth unemployment? And perhaps there are some Africa-wide things. Maybe I'm wrong. So how do you see the issue?
First of all, my name then is Lars Thunell. I'm heading up International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And here in Africa, we work in about 35 countries, both with finance and advisory services, and have about 400 people spread in offices across. I'm actually going to South Sudan to open our office there tomorrow. But I think for us, when we look at this problem, the issue is all about SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. Because that's where you find, in most countries, 70% or 60, 70, 80% of the jobs are actually in that sector. So then we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to really help those companies be established and grow? And first of all, it's a question of moving them from the informal sector to the formal sector. Because we know that on the average, if a company moves or an enterprise moves from the informal to the formal sector, it grows statistically about 8 times as fast. Really starts to create jobs, really starts to pay taxes to the government, can import and export and so forth. So what can people do? The governments have their investment climate. What are the rules for the small and medium-sized enterprise? How easy is it to start a new company? How many forms do you have to fill in? What is how much does it cost? So that's one very important part. Access to finance is another one. Bankers, do they really lend to these companies? Very often they don't have collateral. They have to take other securities. A third thing that we see is training. As a company grows, entrepreneurs need training. They need to learn how to actually do it. And finally, I would say infrastructure. Here in Africa, in many places, we all know that there is load shedding, and if you're running a manufacturing plant and you can't have your lights, or if you have to have all these reserve requirement generators, it costs you a fortune to do that. Broadband being very important for computers. Transport. We know that we see in studies that here in Africa you can reach the same productivity within the walls of a plant, but getting the stuff in and out, that's where you really get hurt. So that the transport aspects. So these are the type of things. I would also, even though most of these things will happen in the urban areas, and I think the investment climate is also very much tied not only to the country level, but actually to the local city level, but farmers. I met the head of a labor union for farmers in Malawi, 1 million members, I think. And he said to me, remember, even though I come under the label of labor union, we are really small businessmen and businesswomen, all of us. And now with the higher food prices, which is terrible for many, but it actually creates an opportunity for these business people to move forward and create jobs that are meaningful and create the kind of a good circle where they have a little extra to spend, which will then allow for others even out there to provide them with areas. So I think those are to us the key areas where we all in IFC are working on all of these, trying to move the agenda. I'll just add one final thing before my 3 minutes are out, and that is gender. The women entrepreneurs of Africa, the way we see them, are fantastic, and they should be given as much chance as they ever can. They are more disciplined, they spend their money that they earn better ways, and they are very creative. But very often there are legal issues relating for them to establish their business. And bankers don't lend to them. So that is something that I think special actions have to be taken.
Great. Can I ask Alex to come in now with a business perspective? What do you think?
And thank you. Alex Kyriakidis, President for Marriott International, Middle East and Africa in the UAE. I'm going to share with you some context setting, some of the best kept secrets, if you like, about the travel and tourism industry in the context of economic activity creation and job creation. And I want to set you a global context and then a very specific sub-Saharan African context. Globally, this industry, if you add up direct and indirect investment in travel and tourism, we're speaking about a $6.3 trillion industry. It supports 250 million jobs. About 1 in 12 people working on the planet are in travel and tourism, directly or indirectly. And $750 billion were invested last year in travel and tourism. That's the global scene. Let's come down to sub-Saharan Africa as a market. This industry today is just shy of 90 billion in economic activity. It employs 13 million people. And last year, $13 billion was invested in it. Now, this is a very powerful job creator. I can mirror to you examples based on our experience in Africa. Today, we're into 3 countries in Africa with 8 hotels. Within the next 4 years, we will go up to 21 hotels, 4,800 rooms, and we're going to have to employ 2,000 new associates, young men and women, straight out of university or college, to join us and start their journey of employment in the travel and tourism industry within the Marriott International family. So I just really wanted to spend a few minutes setting the scene in terms of the power of this industry to create and support jobs. Why do we have a very positive outlook for this industry in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, I was interested today to attend several of the sessions, and I listened to one in particular, the middle classes here, where you have a scenario where the middle classes in Africa are going to grow from 300 million people over the next 50 years to triple in size, according to the African Development Bank. Then you have the stimulant for travel and tourism. The moment people cross over into middle class, the first thing they want to do is travel, visit family and friends around them. So domestic travel and tourism is stimulated. And beyond that, they then want to travel regionally, and beyond the region, internationally. And we've seen that time and time again. So that's one big driver in sub-Saharan Africa. The other is airlift, and you all know what's happening with airports. You know what's happening with this great airport here in Bole with, 3.5 million passengers, set to get to 5 million within the next 3 years. So tremendous airlift capability. And the third dimension is economic activity. We have 7 out of the 15 fastest growing economies in Africa. Put all that together, and you've got a heady cocktail of demand for travel and tourism product. Anne asked me, how can governments help? Let's start by making sure that travel and tourism is introduced in the agendas at the universities, so that the education part of travel and tourism is embedded in sub-Saharan African universities and colleges. So that's the key, so that when we go to recruit at the campuses, we don't have to start by explaining what is travel and tourism, what is the hospitality industry. And secondly, of course, the governments have to make it easy for people to come in and invest in the country, to put together a hotel, to put together a leisure destination. And that means clearing bureaucracy and, crucially, providing credit for this industry's lifeblood is credit to make it grow. I'll stop here, Anne.
Great, thank you very much. Let me turn to Chinwe and get an NGO perspective. One of the challenges, it seems to me, in the NGO sector is how do you turn the great innovation and enthusiasm that's normally evident there to scale? So how do you see this issue?
Thanks, Anne. My name is Chinwe Effiong, and I'm with the Junior Achievement Africa region. And my colleagues have mentioned several of the drivers for economic growth, so I won't necessarily repeat that. But what I do want to say is that I believe that we all pay lip service to the idea of development, and all, including NGOs, the stakeholders, government, private sector, NGOs, parents, faith-based organizations. Development is a commitment. It's a partnership, and partnerships are long-term. So I have a commitment. I have 3 children. I have a commitment to make sure that their short-term needs and their long-term needs are met. That means that I stay with it through the process until they're out of my house and in their own jobs. But we do, in the NGO community, I start with NGOs, we design initiatives that are not intended to stay with the beneficiaries through the long haul. There's a tendency to run after donor funds. There's a tendency to be responsive and reactive. In the private sector, we have great funders, and JA is very fortunate to have a broad base of private sector funders. And I think our donors are doing a great job. Most of our donors are long-term. But we have a general practice in the private sector where we throw money at development. We give money to 6-month projects, 1-year projects, 2-year projects that are not designed, they're designed from the beginning to fail because they don't sustain the initiative to the end. Government, I'm sorry you asked me to speak about NGOs, but we're all part of a larger ecosystem, and there's the mistake that NGOs make to think that we're going to go into a community and we're going to transform this community. It's not possible. We have to work in partnership and collaborative relationships. That's the only way we can talk about sustainable development. So governments, and there are various levels, there's some that are better than others, but there's an issue around long-term strategic planning. And I shared this in another panel about education. When you look at the investment in education, it's not investing in the right type of education. It's not investing in early education, because when we start talking about job creation and entrepreneurship, it starts early as primary school. It's not when the formative years are already over. So it's really my contribution is that it has to do with partnership. It has to do with commitment over a long period of time and not just a short-term fix.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to somebody who knows Africa very well, and to Abdoulie Janneh, to ask him to give us a broader perspective. And I particularly want to ask you, are there some countries that are doing well? We know there's a big challenge, but which countries are making headway in moving to deal with the challenge of jobs in their society at the sort of scale that's required? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Abdoulie Janneh. I am Under Secretary General of the United Nations, and I currently serve as the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. First, Madam Moderator, you are saying we should be country-specific in terms of the job thing cuts across, and the solutions, the necessary solutions are so similar, and that the challenges being faced are so similar, that really what you say applies from one country to the other. I will come back to the countries that you feel some of who are making headway. But first, let me endorse some of the things my colleagues have said. For example, Mr. Thunell's emphasis on SMEs. I think that's key. I think SMEs would certainly be an area where a great opportunity to create jobs. Tourism sector is another one, and that raises the question of creating skills that match where the opportunities are, and I think that's great. But if you ask me where I start, what point I start from, it is first, governments must center stage this issue of employment and job creation. It should be their problem numero uno. I was telling Madame Effiong that President Holland of France, the newly elected president, when he said, I'm going to look at everything through the eyes of justice and youth employment. That's what he said, And I'm not. That's kind of language I'm not hearing coming out of our content. Obviously, they are aware of it. So center stage it, and then there is growth. If you do that, then you link growth to jobs, and therefore you look at those sectors where that create more jobs. And here agriculture is one, tourism is another one, manufacturing, which has really gone down in Africa, mining, services, and so on. So look at those sectors that really drive the job agenda, and we should pick that up. Then we should also look at who creates jobs in those sectors. The creation of jobs is by the private sector. So make the private sector create the enabling environment for the private sector to be able to thrive. And in some countries, it's happening very well. In a country like here, now it's very private sector friendly. If you take a country like Rwanda, it is to create a business in Rwanda. If you go to the office to create it, you pay $25. If you do it online, it is free. See, it's moving. So you have to give the private sector that possibility. And when we talked of the SMEs, give them entrepreneurial skills, give them access to resources. You know, the banks are not doing that. Are you going to create special financial systems which would facilitate them and so on? So that's important. I also feel that we should look at the possibilities of making sure that some African countries are part of the global value chain. We are not contributing to that. Maybe in the hotel industry we are, but in others, we are not. I mean, for example, we don't make cars. But, Madam Moderator, we can make windscreens for a start, and then we see. And then, why not? It is made of silicon. There's a lot of silicon in Africa. We must give value addition to agriculture. And this value addition, the flip side of it is that we will give this value addition, but the tariff barriers discriminate against finished products from Africa. You know, the tariffs are higher, and therefore our colleagues, you know, in the other part of the world should really look at this. If I produce coffee and export it raw, I pay minimal. If I produce finished coffee and produce it, I'm charged a hell of a lot, which becomes a constraint. The price goes up, and this country suffers from it, and so on. So that also, it's not only what African governments do, but what other African. But having said that, Madam Moderator, there are a few countries that are making progress, that are, you know, raising this debate. Not only the debate, but really taking appropriate action in terms of employment, particularly youth employment. Our youth are going across the oceans and dying. I mentioned Rwanda, which is really creating a very investment-friendly environment. If you take a country like Burkina Faso, they're doing that considerably. I think Ethiopia is doing so. I mean, if you look at over the years, if you take the production of flowers alone and see what they're doing, it's considerable. Yeah, and also the infrastructural work that they are doing here. And you know, without infrastructure, you cannot develop and so on. And so they are doing there's tremendous effort going into that. So by and large, this continues the whole area of growth that produces employment is the biggest challenge facing Africa, but not only Africa, the others too, but really it is a global issue. But for us, I think, you know, the appropriate policies, center staging it, looking at the productive sectors where you feel jobs can be created and so on, and getting support from it would be fine. So I think I will stop it there.
Great, thank you very much. Let's come to, it is noticeable, but our panel does not have someone from the manufacturing sector, and I'll come back to that. But let's give Mohammad Omran an opportunity to talk about, are there any obstacles to the growth of the telecommunications sector? And what you know, this has been a great success story in many ways. What more can we expect? What does the future hold? What contribution can you make to unemployment?
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammad Omran. I am from UAE, United Arab Emirates. I am chairman for Etisalat. We operate in 17 countries, out of them 11 countries in Africa. We have something like 60,000 staff, out of them around 15,000 in Africa as direct staff, but also there are indirect staff which operate like distributors or some other services, which is something like 10 times that number. However, if we talk about Africa, we are talking, according to statistics, that number of population will double by 2040 or 2050. then that means there are challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities. We have seen how telecom have changed a lot of economies and became much better. There are statistics indicate that by raising number of lines per inhabitant, that contribute to raising a GDP. And with that one, more jobs are created. Africa has certain advantages over others because there is no legacy system. There is no established telecom system in many countries. And this gives African a lot of ahead, becoming ahead than others in developing a new solution. We have seen some of the very smart solutions adopted in Africa, whether it is a money payment or a mobile payment, or whether it is some new solution in Nigeria and Tanzania and many other countries. We believe that using these kind of services can add more jobs, but also reaching the rural areas. Africa, like Middle East, there are a lot of population living in rural areas, and these people do not have enough access to education and health and so. If those people are enabled by reaching them with the right telecom services, then definitely that will enable them to work better and to gain better. This will lead us to what should we do or what is needed in order to serve those customers or those population at large. I think there are different stakeholders here. First of all, the government. The government should enable investors to come and should enable those young people to work and to be innovative. Investor in the world has to have enough security for their investment to come and put their money. In another area, we have seen that financing for Africa is very difficult, where you can find financing in many countries in the West and even in the Middle East at below maybe 3%, 4%. If you take financing for Africa, that will cost you 15%, which make a major obstacle. So I think there are different stakeholders should work together, and with that one, we should be able to have better jobs available. We have seen over the last 20 years or even more how India has transformed with the IT. Now, a lot of Indian, a lot of big industries in the world use IT in India. In the Middle East, there is a small country, Jordan, where there are a lot of new solutions being developed. So why not? Something like this became available. I think there is a need for one or two countries to become a model countries with the other following them. This is, I think, a good start for us, and we will see that there is better result coming out of these ideas. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, so far it looks like everybody agrees this is a very important issue and we're all in favor of it. So the question then becomes, well, what's holding us back? What are the obstacles to getting the kind of massive, well, let me rephrase, getting the kind of labor-intensive economies that we need? Now, I'm tempted to ask, a very important point was made. The point was, Abdoulie said, well, this should be the key priority for the country. So the question then becomes, okay, what does that mean? What would you downgrade in a country and what would you move up? Because if the issue was so simple, we wouldn't be sitting here discussing it. Clearly it's much harder, and there is much more intense debate in each country about priorities, about vested interests, from trade unions to very large companies to a range of other interests in society. So what's holding us back? What are the key choices that have to be made to get the kind of scale growth in jobs that we need? Any takers who'd like to respond to this? Abdoulie?
No, you are saying whether it's a question of picking up something and dropping another. It is not that. The role of our states is to plan, and as I say, plan so that there is economic growth, and the challenge for this growth is to make sure that there are jobs. And to the extent that this is the priority for the majority of citizens, you shouldn't have a problem if you put something credible on the table. So let us look, as I said, look at those sectors that would create jobs, agriculture, tourism, manufacturing. But let me just finish.
What does Africa have to do to get a much bigger manufacturing sector? How are we going to get some of those jobs, those low-wage jobs from China?
What advantage does China have over us? I think we can have a manufacturing sector in those areas where we can compete with China. I'm saying agro-processing, for example, madam. Why can't we do agro-processing? Okay. But here I am telling you the constraint is not only that we are capable of value addition in our agricultural products, but we are having difficulty in accessing markets. The answer could be intra-African trade.
Okay.
And intra-African trade, which is
That's one very practical suggestion.
Yeah.
Lars?
Well, I think if there's one thing, it is infrastructure. Because as I said, if you're going to import and export, you need to have electricity, you need to be able to transport things in and out. So I think that's the one thing. But I would also say that it's in any change process, you have to have the leadership. The governments have to be willing to drive this issue. And if you look at just investment climate, which is the other thing that I think completely can be done, it has to be driven. Because there is the bureaucracies, let's face it, I mean, it's nice for every stamp you need for a form process, there's a little chance for a little extra income. And if you only reduce that only to one, that suddenly is a lot of people are losing a little bit of their income. So you have to drive this against sometimes the bureaucracy from the very top and get to these kind of one-stop shopping for small enterprises. So if there are two things I would do is drive investment, climate change, simplifying the processes for starting new companies, and then the infrastructure. And the third one is, of course, again, financing will always be there.
I would echo what Lars said. Today, we are competing in any industry for capital, and owners and holders of capital want the ability to invest their capital quickly and efficiently, and in an ideal world, there is some debt financing to make it work. And as Mohammad and Lars have said, getting debt financing in sub-Saharan Africa is not only very difficult, but it's prohibitive. So for my industry, travel and tourism, which is one of the largest employers worldwide, I would say what we need is for the governments to actually embrace travel and tourism in their strategy, embed it in their strategy, and do everything they can to really cut through bureaucracy so investors can put their money in travel and tourism assets and get some debt financing to help them make them work. It's not a short-term play. This industry is all about medium term, and it therefore competes with some of the quick payback industries out there today in sub-Saharan Africa. So we're very realistic, but there does need to be some help from government to cut through the bureaucracy tape and make it easy for investors to actually invest.
Great. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience now. We'd like to get some comments from you on some of the big issues. What's holding us back? What are the obstacles in the country you know best to getting to the kind of massive employment numbers we desperately need? Whether it's South Africa, which has challenges of its own, or other countries, let's get some more issues on the table. We've already got some very practical suggestions. I'm tempted and like to welcome South Africa's Minister of Finance. It's great to have you here, sir. Perhaps you'd like to come in at some point, but I won't sort of push you. So let's open it up. Let me ask, I'd like to give as much chance to people to comment as possible, so please keep them brief. And so let's get a whole lot of comments, and then I'm going to let the members of the panel come back in a bit later on. So tell us who you are and then fire away. If the people with mics could be as fast as possible, I'd be grateful.
Thank you very much. My name is Arum Ote. I'm the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission in Nigeria. I may have repeated what the panel said because I was in another session, so forgive me for that. One of the things, I believe that one of the things that we have as an asset is a number of young people that we have in this continent. And so as we think about accelerating job creation, we must make sure that the jobs are attractive for them. We also must make sure that they have the skills. And for me, I walked in as Mr. Janneh was talking about agriculture. We need to modernize agriculture such that a young person feels that it is the thing to do and not feel that it's something that their grandmother or grandfather does. And I think that a number of countries around Africa where there's more modernization of agriculture, you're seeing a lot of our young people participate in agriculture and also seek more modern solutions. I also think that what we've seen with telecommunications in Africa shows that you can leapfrog. You can also leverage technology better if you have a youthful population. Finally, I haven't had as much conversations in these fora around what a sector like housing does for job creation. Because think about housing. Housing has linkages from building a house to furnishing it to financial services. Housing provides shelter, allows people to have collateral for raising capital for small and medium scale enterprises. Who are those who are generators of labor? And of course, it helps build capital markets. But I don't understand why the conversations in Africa are not focusing on that. And maybe the panel can talk about that also. Thank you.
Great contribution. Raises the thorny issue of property rights as well. So let's have, yes, sir.
I'd like to ask Mr. Kyriakidis, as well as the rest of the panel, your comments on what has just been passed in the States known as the Jobs Act, which opens up an incredibly exciting way of having micro-investment into PTY limiteds, not public companies, which allows thousands of people to invest to, as I said, to private organizations, which is seen as one of the major drivers of entrepreneurship in America. And as I understand it, America is one of the most entrepreneurial countries around. Do you think we should be doing something similar in Africa? Would you like to comment on that?
Okay, if we can hold that.
Yeah, could you just repeat the opening part of your question, please?
Yes.
Because the mic wasn't very clear up here.
Okay, sorry. In the States, they've just passed the Jobs Act, and part of that is the passing into law allowing people to invest in private companies, not public companies. I think they can invest up to about 5% of their annual income, which means that the private sector is able to invest in young entrepreneurial ideas, which when you're talking about access to capital, opens up a whole new area of capital. And I think it's one of the most exciting areas we can look at the moment. Your comments on that?
I'll give you a chance in a moment. Okay, yes, the back. Sorry, if people could introduce themselves and I think perhaps stand up, it's easier to hear you.
Perfect segue into this. We have a private equity fund in South Africa which has 60% of the funding is actually FDI. It was not made by local South African investments. And we just did a study through the University of Cape Town looking at employment and the impact of employment of this investment. It's about a 2 billion rand fund, about $250 million. And it's absolutely extraordinary to me to see that 100,000 man-years of employment were created over the 10-year life of this fund. 5,000 jobs that are permanent that will go into perpetuity, but in the life of the fund over the 10 years, 100,000 man-years. So I think the issue about infrastructure and the discussion about the need for infrastructure in Africa and the discussion of housing, of which is one of those needed pieces of infrastructure, and the ability to create employment really comes together fantastically because of that factor. And I really would say this is something that we need to focus on. The impediments, and you mentioned very briefly, you said property rights, mortgages, long-term debt, not trivial, because as we as a fund look further up the continent, we're restricted by needing to have good rule of law, property rights, mortgages, and the like in place. And when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there are not a lot of countries that tick those boxes.
Great, thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Sylvester Chauke from Johannesburg, a global shaper in the Johannesburg Hub. My question really is probably more of a comment than a question. I think we know that about 6% of Africa's population is under the age of 30, and we know that there's a huge issue around youth unemployment. I think for me, it's great to have a lot of discussions around what unemployment is and all these important areas, but how about engaging a lot of the youth who are actually really wanting to participate in driving employment?
Yes, sir.
My name is Mike Masharia. I'm the founder and CEO of a tech company in Kenya with offices in the region. And my comment is probably giving you some insight on our industry in terms of technology. I think Africa has been seen as, especially East Africa, as a way of developing intellectual capital and talent from a human resource. And one of the challenges we sort of have seen and trying to tackle is that in Kenya we have something called the Vision 2030, sort of the big vision for the country. Now, how do we align that vision? And what part of the pillars is creating a knowledge economy, right? Now, so how do you create a knowledge economy? And a knowledge economy highly is leveraged on human resource. Now, what we've tried to do with the private sector and government and multinationals is come up with something called a National Innovation Framework. The National Innovation Framework is an ecosystem of multiple players. Number one could be multinationals, could be private sector like ourselves, SMEs, hubs, intellectual property, R&D, academia, right? All these people try and put them together such that they see the bigger vision of creating a knowledge economy, because you need to be able to join the dots, right? And be able to see how all of you benefit, how the academia feeds into R&D, how R&D feeds into venture capital, how venture capital then feeds into SMEs, how then you have a capital markets, how then you have a multinationals. Now, all that has to come together, and you need to create sort of a big vision to see how everybody contributes towards this bigger ecosystem. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me just remind everyone we're really focused on how we're going to deal with a massive challenge of jobs. Not make-work jobs, but economically sustainable jobs. One of the ways in which Asia has done this is through manufacturing and lots of small enterprises. Is there anybody who wants to engage in this issue? If you look at special economic zones, which have been one of the tools that have been used in a number of parts of the world, particularly Asia, to set up enormous manufacturing hubs, mainly for export, the research shows that most of those special economic zones have failed in Africa. So I'm trying to get some conversation going about one of the key issues that's going to affect how we get to the sort of scale that's required. Is there anybody, any business person, government person who'd like to engage on this issue? Because I'm certainly in favor of a lot of the things that have been mentioned, from inter-African trade, absolutely vital. We should stop moaning so much about the unfair rules of trade, which are unfair with other countries. There's a lot we can do in the continent, which requires infrastructure and all sorts of things, and finance. There's a lot we can be doing about small enterprises and making sure we have a much better environment for entrepreneurs to take risks and create companies that then employ people. Great. But what are we going to manufacture in this society? That's going to be vital. So who wants to get involved in this issue?
And if I can just jump in for a second.
Sure.
I think there's an inherent danger in looking for a single solution, because I think
That's
everything that everyone has talked about is part of that, the process that goes into a multifaceted challenge. And related to that is also the danger in looking for a single model for Africa. And for instance, from an NGO perspective, working in 18 countries, if you were to ask me what are the top successes, like everyone else, I would probably mention Botswana and Swaziland and Mauritius. But these are populations that are under 2 million people. And so to use those as models to compare a country like Nigeria, for instance, or Ethiopia. So I think one of the critical elements is to really understand each nation, match industry needs with skills acquisition so that there's a connection there rather than just looking for one panacea. So my colleague talked about diversification, tourism industry. I remember you mentioned housing. There's the arts. There's the finance sector. There's so many that are specific to particular countries that need to be specially focused on for those particular countries to develop and make sure that the skills necessary to feed into those industries are being developed.
Yes.
Well, just a reflection on a few things. First of all, I think the telecom sector really is providing the opportunity for a lot of things, and we see how inventions are coming. We see the payment systems that are now being introduced in Africa for telephone-to-telephone payments, which leapfrogging, as somebody said, the whole technology in Europe, and it's some fantastic things that are happening there. I think the whole question of supply chains, I think, are important, because if you're going to manufacture something, you need to have raw material in, and you need components, and you need, and there I think the Chinese has been very good at putting all of that together. So you can't just have one little factory, you need to have a whole ecosystem. And I think that to construct that is not easy. I'll take one example from the tourist industry. I was in Sri Lanka recently, and they had established a big tourist resort, but the people around it were not getting the benefit of that. But by creating basically a business council of smaller suppliers in the same industry and having them talk to the big resort, and the big resort basically getting to train the smaller suppliers on what type of quality they need, you get the whole ecosystem to really functioning. And I think these are the type of win-win solutions that you can find if you just can create the environment around and the things. I think those are very important. On the housing sector, I think that was a very good comment and very important, because it's not only the quality of life for people, but it is in many economies around the world, it's a mega industry in effect. And there we are from the IFC side, we very often try to work with the regulations for mortgages and induce banks to start to do this business. And there's one sector that is also, it's not only construction of the housing, it's the building material sector. For example, in this country, one of our first investments here was a cement factory, bringing in an investor from Saudi Arabia, invested in the cement factory here. Cement prices went down dramatically, which means that you can afford to build much more infrastructure, whether it's housing or roads or whatever it is. These are the type of things that I think needs to be done. But you can't have one single solution. You need to create, and the government, who normally is used to the idea that they can control things, have to let things go. They have to think about, we're going to enable and create a little chaos here of SMEs and big and small companies. That's what's important.
And let me react to one or two things that we got from Madam Ote. One is the potential of agriculture. We have 70% of Africa's arable land is not being cultivated. So we will feed the world if we invest in agriculture, make it attractive, modernize it, it will absorb a lot of young people, as you said. So I buy that fully. On our point in housing, yes, housing is important. But there's housing and jobs, are congruous. There's a great link. In the United States now, you are not buying houses. So you have to create jobs so that there's demand for housing. And that's one of the justifications for jobs. So that they create this kind of internal. And my final point is on investment. I believe that from where I sit, and I tell you, I have visited every African country, tremendous effort is being made to create the environment to attract investment. It is not happening. Investment, particularly foreign investment, is still dismally low. I know the many hotel industry they are doing. Madam Moderator, returns on investment in Africa are the highest anywhere. It's 30%. Africa has less conflict, Africa is more democratic and so on. How do we really work with our partners to ensure that, encourage more investment? And when I say investment, let us also be bold. Let us be bold and take on some of these big transformative projects. Let us build INGA. It will produce electricity for every African country and everybody could come. So this is what we are going to do, Madam. It is, the conditions are right now for massive investment, bold investments in Africa, and I think most of the countries are really ready for this. Well, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that this forum here is not about education, but I think education is a major pillar for development. As the lady mentioned here about there are a lot of youth, or majority youth, yes, but there is the need to change the mindset, how we educate young people. We have seen a lot of new ideas coming now. Recently, I think it was announced that Singapore will do away with books. All will be on tablet. I have seen some studies indicating that maybe within short period of time, maybe 1 year or two, that a tablet will cost $20. With that one, with the right communication, connecting that tablet, there is a way that every young boy and girl everywhere in the country can access the best education in the world. And with that one, definitely a lot of development will come. So I think this is a major issue, which if we can convince the government to move into that direction, we will see a lot of result in that area.
No, the question that was asked earlier on private investment, it might interest you to know that actually globally, by far and away, majority of investors in the hospitality industry are private, range from mamas and papas running a bed and breakfast, right across the board to high net worth individuals owning luxury hotels. So it is private sector led. But my earlier point was really what we need is we need the governments here to help those private individuals, private sector individuals get started. And the getting started bit is all about having access to some financing to help them get their first small hotel up and running. And that's a challenge now.
Comments? Yes, sir.
I appreciate the efforts to try to make a discussion on manufacturing in Africa, because all of us see the success of Asia. Goodness, why can't that be us? I want to be a little bit down on that as an idea, though. Let's think about why Asia is successful in manufacturing. It is an astonishing global supply chain. It is a remarkable amount of infrastructure, goods, and people.
Let me push back a little bit. I'm certainly not advocating a one-sector approach to growth, far from it. I'm absolutely in favor of a lot of the suggestions that have been made, and the sectors that we have should grow enormously. But think for a moment of the scale of the challenge that faces most countries. You can aggregate it for the subcontinent, and it's hundreds of millions of people who need jobs today. Never mind the population growth that's coming. And then you have to say to yourself, which sectors are going to provide lots of jobs? From what I understand about agriculture, but I'm happy to be told this is different. Certainly in my country, and if you think of the United States of America and Brazil, two of the biggest food suppliers, food growers in the world, as they modernized agriculture, the numbers of people employed went down. This has been the case. Now maybe there are countries in Africa that can have small-scale agriculture and family-based agriculture, and you can keep the numbers at a reasonable level. But we know that over the next 30 years we're going to see massive urbanization on this continent, and in many places you need urbanization in order to free up some of the land and the people for agriculture. So I'm as not convinced in every country, certainly not in my country, South Africa, that increased agriculture, I'm in favor of it. Let's double it in South Africa. That would be great. We would have to turn it around from declining, less than 3% of GDP, to let's say 6%. Fantastic. The numbers of people employed are going to be minimal. Now, so let me ask the question, because I'm ignorant about many African countries. What kind of agriculture are you envisaging, and how labor intensive, and how will it be globally competitive with Brazil and other places if you're going to have a completely different model? So the reason that's a question because I'm ignorant, the reason I'm saying we have to look at what's difficult is because this is not the panacea, but this is a way of creating very large numbers of jobs if you get it right. So it's a question. What's the mix? And it has to be country by country. I know nothing about Nigeria. I'm not competent to comment. What would be the top 3 things if your agenda was focused on job-intensive, higher growth? What are the 3 things you should go for? You know, the countries that you suggested, sir, that are doing well, these are very small countries. I'm with Chinwe on this. These are tiny countries. Botswana, Rwanda, great, good for them. We're talking about massive scales.
Ethiopia has 80 million people. I quoted this
No, Ethiopia, that's fine. Let's talk about Ethiopia. They have a special economic zone. The numbers are tiny. So how do we get to the scale? That's what I'm trying to push for. The kind of, how do we move out of the comfort zone I think people are in now? They're saying Africa's growing, isn't this good? Yes, but it's not sufficient.
And can I just add something before you throw it out to the crowd? Because I think there's a paradigm shift and a change in semantics that we're working on, moving away from how do we provide jobs for young people to how do we make young people job creators rather than job seekers. And so, I mean, I know you mentioned earlier that the statistics is important, but I do want to share the statistics in Africa. If you're looking at all of Africa, it's about 1 billion. Sub-Saharan Africa is 800 million. Of that 800 million, 62% are under the age of 30, some say 24. And that's about 500 million. And of that population, about 45% are neither in school or gainfully employed. That's 220 million young people. I don't care how good a government is, it's impossible to create jobs for that many young people. So if we continue talking about how the jobs are going to be created from the top up, we could keep this conversation on for the next century. But it's how to start from the bottom up. And that's where education comes in. That's where vocational training comes in. That's where matching skills with the industry comes in. And JA is really proud of the work we do with our donors, APSA, Barclays City. We have a whole range of donors who understand that, and they commit to the long haul, starting from primary school, middle school, secondary school, vocational, and some universities where we're teaching young people very early to understand what entrepreneurship is. And entrepreneurship not just as selling, buying and selling, but entrepreneurship as innovation, looking around you, finding solutions to your own problems in your own environment.
No, Madam Chair, you referred to Rwanda and the others as small economies. I think you are right. Sorry. I think you are right. Let me tell you, there's increased consciousness of this in Africa, that we are creating, looking at Africa as one big global market. Last summit, the heads of state took a decision that by 2017 we'll have a free trade area for Africa. That's a fantastic opportunity. And this is not a wild dream, because already South Africa, as part of SADC, COMESA, and EAC are creating, a free trade area. So I say, let's look at that example and make it continent-wide. And once we do that, we have a huge internal market. You talked of agriculture. Agriculture will become important. We have to feed our people. Yes, competitively. We must. And if it's competitively, I also advocate that some element of protection is needed. It exists everywhere. So we have to do that too. But these are great opportunities. These are transformative initiatives that are on the table, and that if you succeed in pushing them, and then have countries like Nigeria, countries like South Africa, and so on, being the levers to drive this, I think you would see a great opportunity for economic development, for job creation, growth with job creation, which will impact on the lives of our people.
Great. We've got just under 10 minutes left. Who wants to add something new into the discussion that hasn't been part of it? Yes, sir. As quick as, short as you can.
Thank you very much. My name is Makwe Haile from the Ministry of Urban Development and Construction. As you said, in the case of Ethiopia, a matter of chance, there is no one best way for tackling the problem which you are challenging for. In the case of Ethiopia, for example, we can do in the sector of agriculture, we can do the mechanized farm. A matter of chance, we do have urban land, rural land, agricultural land, which is not occupied by farmers. So we can have a commercial farms, and the government already secured around 3 million hectares of land, and we can invite foreign direct investment to have a mechanized farm. At the same time, in the case of developing country, the first and the foremost point is, I agree with the panelists that attitude change is a critical point. So to transform and convince small holders, the farmers, in spite of leaving their small parcel of lands, so to convince them so as to make them supporting skills and supplying inputs so as to make them efficient and productive. So to make efficient labor utilization as economy so as to produce the overall production of the national gross product. So having this in the sector of agriculture, you challenged the group and for the discussion that for having a manufacturing sector to be a level of expected level to create job. So I think even if we go as maximum as possible to invite foreign direct investment and to create conducive environment for investment. I think the most guaranteed track is to create conducive environment for job creation and for small and micro enterprises. So that is a guarantee from the nation, so as to have as many graduates as possible from micro and small enterprises to a medium level, and then whatever the next step. So having, as Madam said, a combination of sectors, the agriculture, the micro and small enterprises, the services. So I think it is a combination of all sectors that which bring growth and then job creation, and at the same time to tackle the attitude change and entrepreneurship, which is the right way to give emphasis, I think. So this is my point to add more.
Great, thank you very much, Minister. I have the gentleman at the back there. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Jean Chao-Pua from Rio Tinto. I wanted to support the point on entrepreneurship. The gentleman said mining and resources were part of the solution. And I think with mining, we create a lot of jobs in the construction phase. So you can create up to 15,000 jobs in construction. Then when you get into operation, that number drops drastically. We're then left with communities who are looking for jobs. And I think the answer is we've got to create more entrepreneurs. Often you have communities that need a lot of services, need a lot of skills, and we really need to focus on creating entrepreneurs so that they provide their own services. Yes, we can source a lot more from local communities, but often that's not available because we haven't trained them to be the provider of the services that we actually need.
Great, thank you.
My name is Saf Yeboah Mankwa from McKinsey & Company in Johannesburg. I just want to be a little bit controversial. The work we've done suggests that entrepreneurship actually doesn't work in terms of creating jobs. It's a dead end. What really creates jobs is taking small businesses that are being successful and making them big. That actually works. These creating entrepreneurship is actually such a random act that is actually not a useful exercise to try and stimulate. So that's one, controversial. Second is that I think we have to think about whether or not we are willing to make fake demand to drive jobs. Because the experience, at least in the United States, has been that we have been successful, the US has been successful in taking sectors that the US could become competitive in the end, but needed demand. You can see that in China as well. Needed demand in order for the economies to cross the chasm to become competitive. So a lot of us have talked about value-added mining. We've talked about the construction industry. Unfortunately, if you just looked at it on the face, Africa is not competitive yet because most of those sectors are not productive enough. And so we have to make a decision whether or not governments want to provide what I would call artificial demand for a sustained period of time to let those sectors become at scale and competitive.
Great, thank you.
Can I make one point on this? Yes. We talked of investment, Madam Chair, and I want to beat the drum around an initiative that we have, and that is the issue of illicit flows of resources out of Africa. It is estimated it's of the order of $50 billion a year. And this is not the issue of corruption. This is under invoicing and all sorts of things. And we have a high-level panel headed by former President Mbeki, which is looking into this, and see how can we get governments to take action once we really identify these loopholes and so on. But it's a colossal amount of money that really, if we have, can underpin the infrastructural challenges that Africa is facing. It's a lot of money. And I hope that once this is done, once he has the report out, that he will have regional consultations, we will bring it to the level of AU, and that governments will react to this. And the private sector also, that's part of this problem, would also really support the recommendations that will come out of this. I thought I would put this on the table.
Great.
Can I just answer it? On the question of entrepreneurship, that was my point in the beginning, that the real job creation is getting small companies bigger. The problem is that you never know which ones are going to be the ones who are successful. So you need to start with thousands or millions of them, and then they will a few of them hopefully will grow and become big, and I think that's the important. On the question of which agriculture products, I think there are, wheat obviously is a thing that is highly mechanized, and you're never going to create a lot of jobs. But there are crops like cocoa and vegetables and flowers here in Ethiopia that are rather labor intensive. So you have to figure out which ones you want to go for, and very often you can find, what we are finding is that we're working with combinations where you have an anchor of a bigger industrial farm, and then you have smallholders around it who use that distribution system or collection system to actually get access to good food processing. We should not forget that 40% of the food produced on this continent perish on its way on the marketplace. With today's food prices, I mean, what bigger opportunity in the world is there to just try to capture that? It's an amazing opportunity.
Yes, I'm sorry with that point that our friend from Walmart, the CEO from Walmart, wasn't able to join us, because that is a vital issue. If you think of India and Africa, the amount of food that is wasted, and that raises some interesting and controversial issues in terms of the introduction of large, competitive, fantastically efficient supermarkets and how that affects economies. So I'm going to draw this conversation to an end. I want to thank the panelists for their very interesting contributions, the participants in the audience. This is a vital issue. There are no single panaceas. It's going to differ from country to country, although there are cross-continental innovations and issues that can make an enormous difference, but the real choices have to be made primarily at a national level, and scale is going to be vitally important. And the mix, as the Minister put it, the mix of issues in each country has to be thought about carefully, but we have to be very realistic about delivering at the sort of scale that we're going to need to provide hope for tens of millions of people and to give them a sense of ownership in the society and to have as entrepreneurial economies as possible, bearing in mind that most people are not going to be entrepreneurs, and we have to get the maximum number of people running efficient businesses, and lots will fail. And we've got to get them into the formal sector, paying taxes and being part of the economy and growing as quickly as possible. But what sectors of the economy? Clearly, we've had lots of ideas, from the fantastic success of the mobile telecommunications sector, and there's more to be done, to the enormous potential of tourism, both domestic and cross-border and international, to the housing sector, which I think has fallen off the agenda, interestingly, in the development debate. It should come back on. On the other hand, houses as owning a house as a means of getting some money to run a business is a very important issue. On the other hand, as we discovered in South Africa, people need a job in order to pay for a bond. So there's some sequencing issues that are quite tricky here. So getting the package right is really important. I think a lot more hard thinking is required, in my view, and some challenge in terms of the scale. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much again to an excellent panel and a tough topic.